What if an appliance emergency didn't have to be? If your appliances suddenly decided they were done, don't stress. Best Buy has you covered with a wide variety of major appliances from trusted brands, in stock and available now. So you don't have to worry about laundry piling up, refilling the fridge, or that big dinner party you're hosting. Because Best Buy has the knowledge and expertise to get you the right appliance for your home. Learn more at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today I was going to be joined today by my conservative counterpart, Sam Dewey, but Sam is apparently MIA. Sam, if you're there, I hope you're not trapped under anything heavy or anything like that. And so we're going to have to sort of ad-lib a little bit here. Sam was going to do some of the story intros, but I'm not on my own. God, you would not want that. I'm actually here with a new voice on the show, political scientist Michael Levy, who Michael and I have known each other since we were in grad school together a million years ago. So, Michael, I'm really glad to have you on the show.
Yeah, great to be with you, Mike, though I should say you made an error in that introduction. It's not my first time my voice is on the show because, as you'll know, for many years I did the intro.
That's right. That's right. Back in the early days of the show, we had this contest, and I had, sort of a contest. I asked a bunch of my friends, I said, can you do an intro for the show? And a bunch of people submitted things, and Michael's was by far the best, and we actually used that for a while. That's right. Very cool. So now, if Michael's voice sounds a little familiar, that's why you have really good voice memory, I suppose.
Well, that was more my radio voice. This is my actual voice.
It was very good. I liked it, certainly. But anyway, so before we do get started, I want to thank a few new supporters. There's Michael. So we are just chock full of Michaels here today. Michael's a new yearly Patreon supporter, which is a thing you can do, and you save 10% over monthly. So Michael, thank you very much. As well as John, a new trial supporter. Thank you guys. We really do appreciate it. And one other thing I wanted to mention is, not long ago, I had the opportunity to be on a podcast as a guest, which is a very different sort of thing for me, as a podcast called What Do We Do Next? And I talked about sort of my journey, if you will, from being a far-right Republican to kind of where I am now, center leftish sort of person, I suppose, and my thoughts on talking to people on the other side, having civil conversations. I thought it was a really good, I had a good time with the interview, and I will make sure to put a link in the show notes, and I hope you check it out. It's not just me. There are a lot of interesting things, I think, on What Do We Do Next. So please check them out. All right. So we'll open today with, surprise to no one, the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's murder. Many Republicans, from President Trump on down, have called for action to be taken against anyone who celebrates Kirk's death or suggested that Kirk was in any way responsible for his murder. Vice President Vance, for instance, said, people have First Amendment rights, but that doesn't prevent companies from firing people for, in his words, being a disgusting person. Vance further said, if you're a university professor who benefits from American tax dollars, you should not be celebrating Charlie Kirk's death. And if you are, maybe you should lose your job or your university should face a loss of funding. So that to me sounds a little bit like constitutionally impermissible viewpoint discrimination by the federal government. We'll get into that, but before we do, there have been widespread reports of people facing disciplinary consequences for their remarks about Kirk's murder, including a number of high-profile people, most notably MSNBC's Matthew Dowd and, of course, ABC late-night host Jimmy Kimmel. And there's been a lot of concern about FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr threatening ABC to get rid of Kimmel or else. Specifically, Carr said that ABC could do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies find ways to change conduct and take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead. And hours later, Kimmel's show was indefinitely suspended. And in response to that, on Friday, Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz, who chairs the Senate committee that has oversight authority over the FCC, said he hates what Kimmel said. He's glad he's fired, but that Carr's response was dangerous as hell. And that's right out of Goodfellas. That's right out of the mafioso coming into a bar going, nice bar you have there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. And, even if a person isn't a fan of free speech for the other side, Cruz pointed out that, hey, you go down this road, there's going to be a time when a Democrat wins again in the White House, and they will silence us. They'll use this power, and they will use it ruthlessly, and that is dangerous. Now, I was going to start with Sam on this, but Sam not being here. Michael, what do you think about this whole reaction to the Charlie Kirk's murder, especially it seems like the crackdown on speech?
Yeah, so what a topic to come out of the gate with.
Yeah.
And for me to say as the first thing that I'm going to say, which is I agree with Ted Cruz, which is not a sentence that I often make. But, I've been thinking about the context of this. And yes, it's a discussion about free speech. But when we think more broadly about this show and the purpose of the show about having bipartisan and civil debate, and I think the key word is debate, has to be based upon some agreement on the rules, a lack of hypocrisy, and some agreement on basic facts. And I think what I'm struggling with, not only on the aftermath of Charlie's brutal and terrible murder, is how it fits into the context of the second Trump administration and almost poisoning all debate and weaponizing government in a lot of different ways, whether it's housing regulator Bill Pulte dragging the Fed governor through fraud headlines, or Carr flirting with pretty heavily punishing a network or all networks and scolding late night comics as court clerics, with even folks like Ted Cruz pushing back on that, Attorney General Pam Bondi vowing to target hate speech, then walking it back because, well, the Constitution, and some outrage on the right because they know a future Democratic president hell-bent on a revenge could turn the tables on them. Tulsi Gabbard and accusing Obama of treason, going after George Soros and nonprofit organizations because he's a bad billionaire and they don't like him, and rewarding Larry Ellison on the TikTok. And it's sort of a pattern. So it's free speech is the issue that we're talking about with the aftermath of Charlie Kirk, but it's really more about the weaponization of government.
Yeah. And, this was a president who, in his inauguration speech, which wasn't that long ago, said, "Never again will the immense power of the state be weaponized to persecute political opponents." And on his first day, he signed that executive order restoring freedom of speech and ending federal censorship. And yet it seems clear to me that this means almost nothing. And I think this really draws an important distinction between a Republican like Donald Trump and a Republican like Ted Cruz. I'm no fan of Ted Cruz. You're no fan of Ted Cruz. But I think he really is, at heart, a constitutional conservative. And this is why real conservatives want, at least one of the reasons why they want a small federal government, because they believe that so much power is almost inherently corrupting. I think this really illustrates a sort of a cleavage in Trump republicanism and more traditional, say, Cruz-type republicanism. On this side, both of us are with Ted Cruz on this.
Yeah, and we'll see how many voices come to the fore over the coming days and weeks. I was heartened by Ted Cruz and what he said, heartened by some of the comments that have come out from others, both podcasters, conservative journalists. I've been reaching out to some of my conservative friends on social media and sort of like asking them, and they've been in the same camp as a Ted Cruz. What I'm worried about is when some of the more MAGA right folks go on television and simply are sycophants of Trump, not wanting to cross him, and then comments that like Trump and hate speech when Jonathan Karl asks him a question from ABC and says, well, we should go after you. You have hate in your heart. And it's a very chilling environment. And I'm going to go really far afield here. And I don't know if you saw on CNN last night that Stephen A. Smith was interviewed, the sports personality. And he kind of talked about that folks kind of need to understand what's coming. And he kind of suggested that he was going to, he's going to be balanced. He has to be balanced. He has to go after everybody, and he can't just go after one side or the other. And when you hear a voice like Stephen A. Smith kind of sounding like he's maybe pulling back. That's worrying because you need to have the strong personalities, not be fearful. Yeah. And I do worry about that fear that's going to start gripping in on news media, what they cover, what they don't cover, what they say and what they don't say.
Yeah, and it's clearly not just the FCC commissioner. I mean, Donald Trump himself has made it very clear that if you're resolutely negative against me, well, then your license should be taken away. And again, this is unquestionably unconstitutional viewpoint discrimination, and I don't think that this would for a moment be a winning case in the courts. But as I've said for a while, with all of Donald Trump's actions against the media, whether it's these ridiculous multi-billion-dollar lawsuits against the New York Times, which, by the way, the judge recently just rejected by essentially saying that you submitted this 80-something page brief and the first 40-something pages were just blather about how wonderful the president is and how his critics are evil and try again. Or it's his, Wall Street Journal lawsuit or whatever. The point isn't to win in court. I mean, because most of these cases are almost, I would say, slam dunk for the companies he's suing or threatening, the point is to make life so uncomfortable for people and for corporations that they're just going to say, you know what, it's just a lot easier to give in to this guy. It's a smarter economic move, or we don't have to worry about doxing or literally be in fear for our safety. Well, let's just give in. And that to me is the real concern because, I mean, as you said with the Stephen Smith thing, this really seems to be having potentially a chilling effect.
Yeah, and that's what I really worry about is the normalization of this fear. And I have a question back to you, Mike, that I wondered about because you sort of used the word, maybe you didn't use this exactly, but obviously unconstitutional. I wonder if by some miracle or chance that a case emanating out of this went to the Supreme Court, do you think it would be a 9-0 judgment that shutting down ABC and removing its license from its affiliates is a violation of the Constitution? I don't know what constitutional argument would be made, but are you sure it's a slam dunk, or you think Alito and Thomas might be 2 votes in favor of it?
Well, I guess when I think about that, I think of a case from, I think it was 2024, so pretty recently. It's Murphy versus Missouri. And this was the jawboning case. Folks might remember that the issue here was that there were questions raised about whether the Biden administration impermissibly essentially forced social media companies, Facebook in particular, to moderate in such a way that certain COVID misinformation, or at the time was whatever was seen to be misinformation, was not being put out there and making its way to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court rejected this in the sense it was really a procedural kind of thing, it was a standing thing. But 3 of the justices who dissented, essentially saying that the state cannot just do this jawboning, which basically is kind of implying that if you don't go along with us, bad things are going to happen to you in the future. Well, the person who wrote that dissent was Sam Alito, and he was joined by Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch in that. And so I think it would be really difficult, given the fact that the circumstances seem even, similar, and I argue the case is even stronger here, I think it would be incredibly difficult for Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch to sort of find a way to, I don't see how they can just reverse themselves. So yeah, I think this would probably be a 9-0 sort of thing. Maybe, I don't know, maybe an 8-1, but I think it would certainly be a slam dunk.
I know we're sort of like talking about the free speech component of this, and maybe we don't want to veer off in this other direction. But I'm sort of also wondering, because part of the pretext for not the Jimmy Kimmel, he wasn't fired, but relieving him of duties for some time, was related to this radical left lunatics who are poisoning America, and that we have to be able to suppress this because left-wing violence and the support networks, whether it's the Open Frontiers and George Soros or other groups, they have to be suppressed. I'm just sort of like wondering if that's gotten lost in all of this, that the right has been assailing the left for so many years about identity politics and about doxing and about cancel culture. And in effect, what we've seen is that cancel culture and doxing is not something that the left has sole control of, that the right seems to love, doxing and canceling, whether it's the Cracker Barrel logo or on this. And I was sort of like looking back at the stats and I'm like, well, all of the murders last year, according to the ADL, of political violence were committed by right wing. And I'm looking at a Cato Institute study that showed since 2020 that 54% of the murders have been associated, political murders have been associated with right wing violence and 22% left wing. I'm just sort of like trying to figure out like the framing of this and the crackdown. It's not just the free speech component, but it's also a particular type of free speech of people who are opposed to the administration.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for a long time I felt that, and I think sort of historical record to back me up is that a lot of Americans really don't care so much about free speech as a concept. They care about their free speech. But when it's the other, and of course, where free speech is the most important is her viewpoints that we find, as it's Vice President Vance put it, disgusting. And that's where it really matters. And that's where it tends to crumble the quickest. And we've seen this throughout our history. And so it doesn't really surprise me here. I guess what just is disheartening to me is that it does seem part of a larger sort of movement. I mean, President Trump has talked about making Antifa, designating it as a terrorist organization, but it's not even an organization in any sense. And it just basically seems, and this is my concern with a lot of people on the left, is now it feels like this is open season. And I guess I should say that I almost, if somebody were to post something like a school teacher or a worker is just like, you know what, Charlie Kirk was a horrible person and I'm glad he's dead and he had it coming. Okay, I can sort of see somebody facing disciplinary action for that. But when it's comments that are not like that at all, are just saying, well, how did this happen? How was this person, how was his murderer radicalized in this way, or what's going on? Well, those sort of things seem to me to be legitimate questions to ask, as well as questions about how either side is using this in some way to try to score political points. And that seemed to me to be more or less what Kimmel was saying. And so I think there's an important distinction there.
Yeah, and I think you're getting at this distinction between cancel culture and consequence culture that's been discussed a lot recently. And certainly folks have the right to say what they want, no matter how vile or vulgar it is. But there may be consequences to your speech, whether it's your employer firing you or losing advertisers or the like. And the interesting thing, of course, with Kimmel is the quote that we're hearing focused on is really that one criticism it wasn't anything about the murder itself, because he had gone on to say several days before for a couple of times how terrible the murder was. It should never have happened. We shouldn't tolerate this kind of violence in the United States. And really what got him fired was critical of the MAGA right and podcasters who he accused of trying to come up with ways that this was somebody other than their own. And so he wasn't actually saying anything celebrating the Charlie Kirk murder. It was more about the podcasters in the MAGA right who he said were ginning up reasons for this to be some left-wing lunatic.
Yeah, and I mean, the same goes for Matthew Dowd, who said, hateful thoughts lead to hateful words, which then lead to hateful actions, and that's the unfortunate environment we're in. And apparently that was enough to get him fired from MSNBC, even though he later came on and said that he didn't mean to imply that Kirk was, in any way responsible for his own death. And so that's the environment. Yeah. In a way, it's not surprising that ABC did what it did. I mean, ABC is owned by Disney, which settled that defamation suit bought by Trump for $15 million, I think a donation to his presidential library, because George Stephanopoulos said on the air that Trump had been found civilly liable for raping E. Jean Carroll when actually he'd been found guilty of sexual abuse and defamation. Now, it's almost certain that ABC would have won that suit, given how difficult it is to prove. And what you have to prove is that the person knew what they were saying was false, or that they spoke with reckless disregard for the truth. Really tough to win. But again, Disney knows that it's going to need regulatory approval for a bunch of things, including ESPN wants to acquire the NFL network. Nexstar is going to need FCC approval for that $6.2 billion acquisition of Tegna. That all goes through the FCC. It's really clear what's going on here. And to think that's if you're saying, well, no, that wouldn't be the case, I think you're blind.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mike. The one thing I may take slight difference of view on is about ABC doing what it did. Yes, there's the merger and the ESPN, but remember, it was Monday night that he made his comments, that Jimmy Kimmel made his comments. It wasn't until Wednesday. It wasn't until Nexstar said it was not going to carry the show, and Sinclair later followed suit. And so at some level, ABC corporate has no choice. If your networks are not going to if the stations are not going to carry the show, there is no show.
Yeah. That's fair. That's a good point. And in fact, the affiliates did carry an awful lot of weight in that. And so, but I mean, I guess, but more largely, right, you feel like this is sort of the cost of doing business is you just don't do, or you tread carefully when you're saying things that criticize Donald Trump.
Coming onto the show, I'll acknowledge, I was like, okay, this is going to be the first topic. And I had written out like my requisite, the murder of Charlie Kirk is a tragedy, is shocking, wrenching, heart goes out, should never have happened, we shouldn't tolerate this, et cetera. Like I had that ready to go because, we're in an environment where if one of us or somebody else says something even remotely problematic, there could be consequences. And just there's this need, whether it's you as a host of a podcast or somebody on social media, just to be really careful. I think we should always be careful, though, in the speech that we make, because we don't want to be glorifying violence. We don't want to be, whether it's this murder or the murder of the United Healthcare CEO.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I guess when I think about sort of the media world we're in right now, it's a very different media world than pre-Trump. I mean, X, formerly Twitter's owned by Musk. Oracle, who's Larry Ellison's company, looks like it's going to buy TikTok. Larry Ellison's kid, David, is the CEO of Paramount Global, which owns CBS. And now the Ellisons apparently are attempting to acquire Warner Brothers Discovery, which owns CNN. So, I mean, when you take a look at who's running these companies and who the four wealthiest Americans, Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, and Ellison, a combined net worth of close to $1 trillion, are now all either, I call them MAGA friendly or MAGA acquiescent. And to me, that's a chilling effect to me.
Yeah, you're definitely right. And let's just throw in Tim Cook with the gold iPhone that he gave Trump. I mean, certainly the entire corporate establishment is being acquiescent because they're fearful of what might happen for their business if they don't play ball with the Trump administration. It makes perfect sense from a business perspective. Yeah. You can criticize them for doing it, but it's also understandable why they're doing it.
Yeah. I also was thinking a lot about, over the last week, I did not listen to Charlie Kirk. I mean, I knew who he was, obviously, but I wasn't, consuming his content, as they put it. And so I went back and I actually listened to some of the stuff that he had to say, some of his college visits and that sort of thing. And, a couple of things come to mind. Number one, there have been a number of lists of kind of the most hateful statements Charlie Kirk has made, that sort of thing. And what I've noticed, and this didn't really surprise me, is that oftentimes these statements appear a whole lot more hateful when when a sentence or two is pulled out of context. But in many instances, when you kind of put that context back, they're what I would call provocative, maybe highly provocative, but not necessarily hateful. And that is just so much of our culture. I found that with figures on both the left and the right. Oftentimes when you go back and you say, okay, well, this is this sentence this person said, yes. But when we put it in that larger context, all of a sudden it takes on a slightly different meaning. And I found that to be true, just as true of Charlie Kirk as many other figures I've done that for. And that to me is not surprising, but again, unfortunate.
Yeah, I think it's fair that in our social media world, in our even less than soundbite version, because oftentimes it's just 10 seconds or 6 seconds of text, that it's hard to convey complexity or nuance in any sort of discussion, whether it's a Charlie Kirk on the right, or I see come up in my feed Dean Withers on the left quite a bit. And it's certainly provocative. It can also be a little bit nauseating to watch whether it's on the right or the left, because you see the skewing and how they're also framing out of context their opponent. And the problem is, and it's not like this is new, is that it's a race to the bottom.
Yeah.
And I was listening to a tech podcast the other day, and they were talking about where social media organizations, where you might like draw the line on what's permissible on the platform and what's not permissible on the platform. And lo and behold, no matter where they put the line, that anything that was right up to the line, that's what got the most engagement.
Yeah.
You know, folks, whether they're the Charlie Kirks of the world or the Dean Withers of the world or whomever, you know, they thrive on being extreme and saying extreme things, because that's what we engage with. If you come up with a 5,000 word treatise on a philosophy of violence, I mean, nobody's going to click on it. Nobody's going to read it.
Yeah, that's true, I think. And I guess, you know, Ezra Klein came out with a column where he said Charlie Kirk was practicing politics the right way, and he got a lot of pushback for that. And I thought about that for a while, and that's what kind of made me want to watch a significant amount of what Charlie Kirk did. And I guess I semi-disagree with him, because I feel like, you know, engaging with people in kind of honest, good faith dialogue with people you disagree with, I think that's really valuable. And there's a way where you can say, well, that's what Charlie Kirk did in these campus visits. He was going to places where people disagreed with him. But I don't get the sense that for the most part, he was all that interested in dialogue. It felt to me more like kind of a form of sort of a rhetorical combat mostly with these kind of very nervous college students, understandably so, often well out of their depth. And to me, that's not real discourse. That's sort of like the political equivalent of the Harlem Globetrotters versus the Washington Generals. I mean, it's entertainment. It's not serious discussion. And so I don't know. I don't know what you think about that.
I couldn't agree with you more, Mike. When we sort of like look at this new format, and it's not that new, of, you know, whether, again, it's a left person or a right person going on and debating 20, you know, liberal debating 20 conservatives or conservative debating, they're not looking for debate.
Yeah.
They're looking to own the other side. They're looking to make a splash, to get clicks so that they can make advertising money, so that they can raise their profile. And I actually don't find that kind of event to be debate or even discussion. It's like watching professional wrestling. Yeah.
And of course, that makes perfect sense why, like you said, that's the thing that gets the sort of engagement in that. But this is not about open discussion and maybe trying to learn something from the other side. This is about creating a viral moment where you own the other side. And that's where we're at right now. And, you know, a number of folks at this point have been saying that Charlie Kirk's murder is an inflection point for the country, including President Obama. And certainly you can make a good case that this is the highest profile, the most significant political killing since MLK and RFK 1968. And what do you think? Do you think this really is sort of an inflection point?
I don't know. And part of the reason I don't know is that when we look at the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's murder, there were some pretty virulent statements about we're at war. We have to be at war. And in the last week or so, since the tragic event, there has been no political violence. And so I think that, yes, there are people who are probably itching for a fight, whether it's, you know, folks in, you know, militia movements and things like that, if we go back to the 1990s. But I don't necessarily think that it's going to be organized political violence, but there could be events here and there. And I definitely, in looking at this Cato Institute study that this one person had written up, if you look at the graph on political motivated murders in the United States, there has been a slight uptick compared to the 1970s and the 80s and the early 2000s in the last 15 years. But it kind of like goes up and it goes down. People are going to be radicalized. We have a lot of guns. And I know that's going to be a controversial statement for some listeners. And crazy people with an axe to grind may take events into their own hands. But I don't expect it to be an organized. But I could be wrong.
Well, I think to me a bigger concern is sort of this sort of slow descent into a kind of a soft authoritarianism. This sort of, well, it's just easier to go along to get along. And given what we know about, corporate power and influence and how much of our media is controlled by these companies that need the government to at least be not hostile to them as they're doing the various mergers and the things they want to do, that we're just going to start to see less and less of this sort of critique. And so it won't be one big violent sort of, Watts is burning or whatever, that sort, that kind of thing. It's just kind of a much more insidious kind of thing. And in some ways that might actually be worse.
Yeah. And as you were sort of like talking and thinking about political violence, I mean, this is, shocking. We are worried about, are we looking at a Malcolm X, RFK, Martin Luther King kind of era of murder? Or is it going to be a little bit of a spike? And then with Melissa Hortman, the attack on Paul Pelosi, the assassination attempts of Donald Trump, the arson / maybe assassination attempt on Josh Shapiro or Gretchen Whitmer's kidnapping. I mean, we certainly, there's a number of events out there. And I do worry that that some disgruntled, radicalized people will take things into their own hands. But again, we're also not at the era of the 80s when Charles Sumner was caned in Congress, right? I do worry about just the breakdown of any civility. And that's what the purpose of this show is to have folks from across the aisle be able to speak to one another in civil tones.
Yeah, absolutely. And normally, of course, at times like this, we would expect political leaders to do stuff to try to lower the temperature. And I think Utah's governor, the Republican governor, Spencer Cox, I think he's really made an effort to do that. But it's certainly not a strength of President Trump and not something he seems at all interested in doing.
Trump is certainly not. And I have been certainly looking at Spencer Cox with some admiration in the way that he has handled himself over a long period of time, but also in this situation. I do wonder, I'm not trying to be overly critical just to be critical, but there seemed to be some sort of, and I don't want to call it glee because that wasn't his tone, but in talking about Tyler Robinson and his relationship with a transitioning man. And it's sort of like, yes, that is true, or it seems to be true, that maybe Tyler Robinson was gay or LGBTQ or whatever. But does it really matter? Does that matter? Is that the thing that we need to be conveying to folks? He was obviously a radicalized person, whether he was straight or gay or bi or whatever, does not matter. They were radicalized, committed a horrific murder. And so I think we need voices like that. But also in the context of some of the discussion that's been happening over the last few months about trans murderers, I wondered if that was a statement that he would like to take back. Again, not that it wasn't true, but there seemed to be like trying to put that out very quickly.
Yeah. And this thing resonates much differently on much of the right than on the left, because I think for a lot of people on the right, certainly I believe this is fair to say for Charlie Kirk, that if you are trans, you are by definition mentally ill, and there's this nexus they want to create or argue for, that, well, if you're trans, you're mentally ill, you're unstable, you're quite possibly ready to do violence, and here is an example of that sort of thing. And that to me, if I were a trans person, that would certainly, this whole thing would make me very, very nervous.
Yeah, and I understand that like that's exactly the way that you described it is exactly how it's being used. But it's kind of interesting / rich in a sense, because if we think about affirmative action, if we think about the discussion and debate over DEI, a lot of that is around identity politics. And the right has been arguing for a long time about treating folks as individuals when they're applying to college or applying for a job or whatever the case may be. And in this sense, we're talking about applying that identity politics, that let's just say that I am a trans person who commits a murder, then is that indicative of the entire trans community, or is that indicative of me as a human being? Yeah. We don't label, and I'll give an example that would be true from the past, which is a radical right-wing Christian who murders a doctor who performs abortion. We wouldn't label all Christians as being murderers.
Right. But that's because most of us don't see Christianity as a mental disorder. Although
yes.
there are some people who would make that argument, but that's considered to be a very fringe sort of thing. Whereas, of course,
you might get canceled for that, Mike, if you
exactly.
Some people.
But the other thing I wanted to point out is, the Trump administration has been very aggressively going after companies, going after DEI sort of stuff. And I think there's an important distinction between that sort of effort when you can make a case, and I don't agree with it, but you can make an argument that, well, what's going on here with a lot of DEI initiatives is a sort of reverse discrimination. It's actually, they would argue that it's against, if not the letter, then at least the spirit of the 14th Amendment and so forth. And that's a very different thing than going after people for just saying nasty, hateful things about the President of the United States. At least I think that's a huge distinction, and I think that's one that is sometimes maybe gotten lost here.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement, Mike.
Yeah. So any other thoughts that you wanted to express about the Charlie Kirk murder, the reactions or anything like that before we...
not really, except I'll say, I've kind of almost been waiting for, and I'm going to bring up a historical reference, Joseph Nye Welch, was the chief counsel to the U.S. Army during the McCarthy hearings. And I'm just waiting for somebody to kind of say, do you have no sense of decency let's just lower the rhetoric. Let's look at each other as human beings. Let's not portray our opponents as radical left lunatics or racist, bigoted, right-wing fascists. Let's just bring the tone down.
Well, hell, Mike, that's boring.
I know.
That's not gonna play. Anyway, it is. The murder was just incredibly awful and horrific, and the reactions. It's been a rough week, certainly, for sure.
I'll make one more comment.
Yeah. Please do.
Which is related to AI. And I know this is really further afield, but I did see a clip of Charlie Kirk's assassination. Yeah. And when I first saw it, I thought it had to be AI. There's no way that could be real. And I know that this is actually going to be a worry as we go forward on a lot of things is it AI or is it real? Did they really say it? And AI is getting so scary good that it's not going to be, you're going to be able to not just pick up on words that your opponent said, you're going to be able to put words in their mouth.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to something different at this point. Now, I'll talk a little bit about crime because crime has been in the news a lot lately. And again, this was forgive me, folks. This was a story Sam had the intro prep for. I will do my best. But the House recently passed a couple of bills about crime in D.C. There was one, the D.C. Crimes Act, which actually passed with 31 Democrats voting for it, that prohibits D.C. officials from changing sentencing laws and restricts the ability of judges to go easier on younger criminals. And there was another one that lowers the minimum age at which someone may be tried as an adult for certain violent crimes from 16 to 14 years of age. And in addition to that, we had President Trump issuing an executive order about the National Guard to Memphis. It creates this thing called the Memphis Safe Task Force to reduce violent crime in Memphis, which, by the way, has a lot of violent crime. I believe it's number one per capita in at least murders. And also the Tennessee governor will make the National Guard available to assist with this under Title 32. What that means is that funding for the Guard will be provided by the federal government, but the Guard is still under the operational control of the governor, in which case then this doesn't bring up posse comitatus and that sort of thing. And so the Guard can actually be used for law enforcement efforts. So, Michael, this has been an ongoing thing, right? First we saw it in LA, then DC. Now we're looking at Memphis and then possibly Chicago to come, a city that means a lot to both of us for different reasons. But what do you think about these latest developments?
So I live in Chicago. And there already is a federal presence. And in the local news today, they were talking about different protests and arrests and things like that. So when the administration talks about sending troops to Chicago, it's for folks around here, it isn't abstract politics. It's deeply personal. Mm-hmm. But let's be honest, and you talked about this in your crime is too high in cities like Chicago, Memphis, DC, elsewhere. Homelessness is a problem in many cities. families want to feel safe. I go on a 4 a.m. walk on the north side of Chicago almost every morning if it's not raining or freezing. I want to feel safe. So the developments are certainly worrying in a sense if it's for show. And that's part of what it looks like. But Democrats are going to dismiss this reality that there is crime and people are worried about crime. And so here's the challenge. Democrats don't want to look weak on crime, especially after the fallout of slogans like defund the police, but they also can't embrace like blunt theatrics that militarize city centers without addressing the root causes. And I don't know what's going to happen in Chicago, but there's not a lot of crime around Millennium Park or Mag Mile. Is that where the troops are going to be put? Or are they going to be put in the South Side where there is a real crime problem? And in other parts of the city, there's crime problems too. It's not just the South Side. And so I just wonder if it's to look good on the television cameras to win the day, or if there is really going to be a concerted effort that is holistic to help to drive down crime. But that would cost money to have programs, whether it's drug programs or programs to get people off the streets. That's not what we're talking about. It's blunt force for the cameras, not about addressing the root causes.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is performative. And I guess especially when I read the order about Memphis, just like previous orders, I note that there's nothing in there that gives any sort of clear indication of when the troops will no longer be needed. You know, there's no benchmarks being set. And to me, whenever you're planning any sort of an operation, the first thing you do is say, okay, well, what are our objectives? Let's be clear about this. When will we leave? When will we consider this a success? And when you don't have that, that makes me think that either you don't know what you're doing or you're really only doing this sort of for show, essentially. And I understand this politically. I think this plays very well politically with a lot of people. For Trump people, I can see a lot of people saying, you know, finally someone's doing something about crime. I think a lot of people are going to react that way because polling on crime routinely shows that large majorities of Americans see it as a much bigger problem than it is. And I think the big problem that we on the left have made is we tried to sort of talk people out of that, saying, well, look at the stats, they're going down and this sort of thing. That even if we say, well, this is an authoritarian power grab or an occupation, that resonates with me. I mean, I see armed troops on city streets, and that to me just makes me feel uncomfortable as hell. But I'm not the person that the Democrats have to win over. I'm already voting Democratic. You know, and so that's the messaging I feel is just really not where it needs to be on this.
Yeah. And if you look at, if you're going to take a really cynical view, which I'm trying not to, on this. If you look at Trump's approval ratings and you look at it issue by issue and you look at inflation and some other things, I mean, Trump is very much so underwater. On the crime issue, he's actually not.
Yeah.
I'm looking at a recent Economist YouGov poll from about a week ago or so, and it was 46-49. This is a potentially winning issue for Trump. And Democrats risk looking really weak or out of touch because you're right. There is a crime problem. People are worried about crime. When I was moving to Chicago back in January, some of my friends said, oh, don't live in that neighborhood. There's a lot of crime right there. So, saying that crime rates are coming down is really false comfort for folks. Folks in cities, whether it's Shreveport, Louisiana, or Chicago or Memphis, they want their administration, whether it's local, state, or federal, to do something about it.
Yeah.
But as you said, what is the definition of success? The reality is, and this is cynical, but it's also true, Trump will claim success whether it's a success or not.
Yeah.
We're going to bring down the drug prices 1,000%. What does that even mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. But I also worry about an overreaction in that, and we didn't talk about this, but, there are some people saying on the Charlie Kirk thing, well, maybe Republicans are overreaching here. On this, I wonder too. Maybe not, though, because when I see something like trying legislation that says, well, you can try a 14-year-old as an adult, that makes me pretty damn uncomfortable, honestly. I think that's just fundamentally wrong.
I mean, there's a lot of things that in the criminal justice system that feel problematic. And this isn't a problem of the left or the right. It's about the signals that politicians want to send, whether it's Bill Clinton, if you recall, during I can't remember, I think it was the 92 election when he flew back to Arkansas to make sure that somebody faced capital punishment and didn't get a reprieve. And I think that person maybe it was low IQ or anyway, we know that politicians want to look tough on crime. And I just worry that the victims of this are going to be people who shouldn't continue to be victimized. However, if you look at it's hard to make that kind of distinction. And I hear you on the 14-year-old because I feel pain about that. But 15, 16, 17, what's the line? And I think that there's going to be a difference of viewpoint on when people should be able to be prosecuted as adults. And I'm anxious about it, but I think there's going to be honest disagreement on how low to put these things.
I've been thinking more about this as well because a few weeks ago I interviewed a guy, David Garland, in his book Law and Order Leviathan about incarceration, and some folks have probably listened to that. It's been up for a few weeks, and just knowing that crime has basically been on a downswing. Crime was much more of a problem in the 90s than it is today, and I think there was a time. Maybe it was pre-Trump, where there almost seemed to be an emerging consensus with sort of the libertarian right who were saying, my God, we're locking too many people up. It's costing a bunch of money. And so many of these things we're locking people up for are nonviolent drug crimes. And we should not. And that there almost seemed to be like a coalition forming to kind of make some reforms. And we started to see some movement on that, I thought. But now it just seems like that has just been stopped in its tracks. And that to me is because it seems to me that the evidence is pretty good that if you lock somebody up, what you're doing is almost certainly creating a lifetime criminal. That's not what we should be in the business of doing. It doesn't make sense on humanitarian or on economic grounds. And that's why sort of our retreat from that sort of what I was hoping would be an emerging consensus is just really disheartening to me.
Yeah, I mean, we can maybe all remember, or we can remind us to remember 2018. I think it was Kim Kardashian going to the White House, and she was championing criminal justice reform, and Trump also championed that criminal justice reform exactly the way you're talking about for low-level drug-related or white-collar crimes, and trying to reduce the number of folks who are in prison because, as you said, if you're in prison and you get out of prison, it's hard to get a job. You may revert to some sort of criminality to be able to survive. And I think we were going toward that consensus, and certainly that's been made much more difficult in the current era.
Definitely.
I mean, because right now we can't. It's a crime for Democrats and Republicans to agree on anything.
Yeah,
and it's disheartening because I know we know each other from 30 years ago when we weren't on the same side of the aisle, but we had good discourse on and could disagree and discuss politics. And right now, it feels like if let's just say it's Josh Hawley in Missouri, if you say Josh Hawley voted aye on this, like reflexively, the Democrat's going to say no matter what the bill is about.
Yeah, definitely. All right, why don't we move on to our final story for this weekend episode? Is that upcoming continuing resolution to fund the government or keep it from shutting down. Again, another story that Sam was going to lead us on, but I will do my best, folks. And it looks like right now that we are seeing another game of chicken emerging, with Republicans saying, well, they want a clean CR for 7 weeks so that the budget process can finish, though they have added a bunch of money for security for federal officials and especially for lawmakers and some other things like that. Whereas Democrats want a little bit more. They want an alternative CR that would preserve the enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies put in place during COVID. And also, the other big thing they want is limitations on the president's ability to withhold or to shift spending that's authorized in the bill. And so I guess the big question here is, well, will we have a government shutdown? Because it's pretty clear that neither of these plans is going to make it past the Senate, where they'll need 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. And so the question is will either side blink? And if not, who's going to win the shutdown and how long will it be? So I'll let you take those questions however you want, Mike.
Yeah, so I think that unfortunately we're going to have a government shutdown. I try not to have a crystal ball, but just like looking at the votes that happened in the Senate and looking at the fact that the Trump administration has, unfortunately, on these types of issues, not tried to include Democrats in the negotiations. As Biden, when he was faced with this, he would bring the Republican leaders, they would look for a deal, Mike Johnson, and he would make a deal, and then it would pass. I just don't see that happening. I don't know who wins the shutdown battle. And I think a problem with the shutdown battle is the Republicans are looking at kind of a clean bill, and Democrats are worried about, as you said, the ACA subsidies that are going away. That's going to make an impact on people's lives, a dramatic increase, maybe, 30, 40% in some of their premiums. Democrats are rightly worried that if Trump is allowed to do rescissions packages, and if there are compromises that are made, that he can just take them out of his own free will, that makes any compromise difficult. But I don't know who wins the politics at all. The only thing I do know is that Democrats are in a bind, because if they don't fight, they look weak to their base.
Yes.
If they don't compromise, then they shut down government and they materially worsen the lives of their constituents.
Yeah, I think looking back in history, the majority party almost never wins a shutdown, especially when it has the sort of trifecta, right? Presidency, House, Senate, that the Republicans do. And I think that's in part because the public isn't, generally speaking, politically aware enough to really understand the intricacies. Say, well, if you're in charge of these three branches, then of these two branches, well, then you should be able to get stuff done. I think that's in the Democrats' favor. But also, I think more and more, when I look back at historical examples to say, well, how these things usually play out, I don't know how well that stuff actually speaks to our present moment, because we're so much more polarized now that I don't really know that those examples are necessarily, even from just the Obama administration, I don't know if those examples are all that relevant anymore to our current situation.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mike. I was thinking about this as we were preparing for the show, and I was thinking, okay, and I'm going to use rough numbers. 40% are going to automatically blame the Republicans. 40% are going to automatically blame the Democrats. And the fight's over the remaining 20%. But the reality is, that 20% probably isn't following it that closely. Yeah. They're going to see the headlines. They'll see their social feeds. They'll see what their friends are saying. And so the shutdown politics are a crapshoot, and nobody knows exactly how it's going to play out. My guess is, and this is only a guess, is that with the social media algorithms, and I know I'll get in trouble for this, probably a little bit more favorable to right-wing framing. My guess is that the Democrats are not going to look great in a shutdown, but I could be.
I don't think that Schumer can really afford to be weak on this time, especially he certainly is feeling the pressure from his left flank, AOC and others, right? And this is one of the few pressure points that Democrats can actually exert some sort of influence on, right? Because the budget is really the only must-pass legislation, and so it's really the only real leverage they have. And also, because I think they're pushing the ACA subsidies thing, because Trump pulls lower on healthcare than just about any other major policy issue. And so not only this gives them, even if I don't think they'll fold on this, but God only knows, they have a history of doing that. It gives them two bites at the apple here, right? First for the CR, and then for the annual appropriation, which will eventually come. And I think they have to take advantage of this, because otherwise, saying, well, let's just wait until after the midterms, that's not a very good strategy, I don't think.
The Democrats are also not going to get anything out of the midterms, right? Yeah. Like, they may be able to hold hearings, but Trump is going to have a veto, 10. Probably not going to control the Senate. I think that's a long shot at best. But, Chuck Schumer is fairly feckless as a leader, but I don't know if anybody could be any better. Chuck Schumer kind of reminds me, and maybe I am totally dating myself here, but if there's a Yosemite Sam Bugs Bunny cartoon where Bugs is saying, don't cross this line, just keeps on crossing the line and crossing the line. I think that, Schumer is a lot more bark than he is bite. But maybe he has no, as Trump would say with Zelensky in the White House, you have no cards. And I don't know if the Democrats actually have any cards.
Yeah, they sure don't have that many, that's for sure. All right, well, I think that pretty much brings us to the end. And hey, if there was anything that Michael and I talked about in this episode you disagreed with, or you thought we were right on, or you just have a question about, we'd really love to hear from you. You can email us, mail@politicsguys.com. You can also reach us through Facebook or X. We always put links in the show notes. And there's, of course, our Discord discussion forum for supporters. I'm on that all the time. And if you're a supporter, you don't just get access to that. You get ad-free versions of everything we release, the full-length midweek episode instead of just that 15-minute preview. And we hope that that's enough of incentive, but also the biggest incentive as far as we're concerned is you make it possible for us to do this week in and week out. It literally would not be possible without supporters. So thank you very much. And you know what? If you would like to support us, but you're just not financially in a position to do that, but you still want to hear that full-length midweek episode, totally not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you support us or not, it really does help out a lot if you could subscribe, rate and review us on your podcast app, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, before we go, as always, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,